Hi guys, today I'm going to be discussing the topic of euthanasia and the moral ethics behind it. Euthanasia by the American Medical Association is defined as the legal administration of a lethal agent by another person to a patient suffering from incurable and insufferable pain. While philosophically, euthanasia is the practice of intentionally ending a life to relieve pain and suffering. The argument is that is euthanasia moral or immoral, and should the circumstances and situation change our response to it? The legal case discussed in this speech is Mrs. Diana Pretty versus Miss B by author K. M. Boyd from the year 2002. The premises of the case are assisted suicide and how the court had different rulings for two different patients. Diana Pretty suffered from an incurable progressive degenerative motor neuron disease. While this case was being appealed in the High Court, she had reached a stage where she was incapable and completely dependent on others. She could not speak, she could not eat, she could not move around or control her bodily functions. The case of Mrs. Pretty was that she was physically unable to commit unassisted suicide, which wasn't illegal in England, but she needed the help of her husband, which was illegal. So she appealed to the court. The contrasting case is Mrs. B, who was a woman in her 40s who was not suffering from an incurable disease, but was in the hospital because of the administration of an artificial ventilator keeping her alive. She appealed to the court in her sound mind to withdraw treatment. The first argument is that Mrs. Purdy, while unable to perform physically, was able and allowed to make decisions for herself as she suffered pain, so she decided that she wanted to die. She had given her consent and made her intentions clear about her life, and yet the court decided her husband could not assist euthanasia without being tried in court for assisted suicide. Brock, in his paper, argues that patients who have self-determination and give consent should be able to euthanize themselves. While Mrs. Pretty could have morally ended her suffering, her husband would have been legally charged with assisted suicide, while Miss B, who was in the hospital, was permitted by the court to refuse treatment, not to end her pain, but with the intention to die. The moral issue is that how are these two cases different when the patients have made their consent and intentions clear? On one hand, the husband would have been tried in court for consciously taking the life of another human being, but the doctor who had taken Mrs. B off the artificial ventilator with the knowledge that he would be taking another human being's life was left without any legal repercussions. How did the ethicality of euthanasia change different situations, and how is it moral to do so? These cases also bring to light the acts of active and passive euthanasia, and if there is a difference between them, and if there should be. This argument can be discussed with the help of James Rachel's paper on active and passive euthanasia. He states that there is a moral difference between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia and gives reason to believe so. Active euthanasia can be much more humane sometimes than passive. The conventional doctrine by the American Medical Association leads to decision on irrelevant grounds. The conventional doctrine rests on the assumption regarding the morality of killing someone versus letting someone die, and the common argument on the favor of this doctrine are unsound. When he says that active euthanasia is much more humane, he argues that if someone like Mrs. Pretty was suffering from an incurable disease and the treatment is ineffective, while they are in extreme pain for months and they have time before they pass away from natural causes, he says, would an active euthanasia be much more humane course of action? The case further discusses how the main goal of the courts should be to preserve life and not permit people to end their lives, which was what they achieved when they denied Mrs. Pretty's request to assisted suicide, but not when they allowed Miss B to stop all treatment. Boyd discusses in his paper, saying, in the eyes of the law, the different judgments in these two cases are not inconsistent. The author discusses the point that the media's attention of Mrs. Pretty's case raised questions in the minds of the public. If the ruling of the court would have been legally right or morally right, the care of the patient should exhaust all legal and moral options before the patient should be able to make the decision of euthanasia. What the author concludes from these cases is that whether law, medicine, and society will ever be able to make the moral distinction between those circumstances in which assisted suicide can and cannot be justified dependent on the patient's medical diagnosis. What I conclude from these cases is that while it was morally wrong to allow Miss B to commit euthanasia, as the goal should be to preserve life, and she was not terminally ill and her treatment was working, even though it was legally right to deny Mrs. Pretty assisted euthanasia as she was terminally ill and her treatments were not working, it was morally wrong to let her suffer and be in pain until she died from natural causes. The defining moment is how these two cases were similar on so many grounds, yet they were given different decisions regarding euthanasia. In my opinion, I do think that euthanasia is morally right and it should be used as a medical treatment in hospitals. When a patient who is suffering from an incurable and untreatable disease, they should be given the option to euthanize themselves. If a patient who has the self determination to keep themselves alive every single day, they should also be able to make the decision when they should die.